Hello and welcome to the CUFI UK podcast for Zion's sake. My name is Alastair, this is Alex.
Hello.
And in today's podcast, why we should all be concerned about Turkey's deepening hostility towards Israel.
That's right. We'll also look at David Lammy, the UK Foreign Secretary's speech at the United Nations Security Council and what he said about Israel.
That's right. Plus, we invite you to leave your comments and thoughts about any of the topics we discuss in today's podcast. Okay, then, Alex, here we are again, and another week, another podcast.
Yep.
There's a lot going on in the world, and I think we are paying close attention to what is happening in Europe between Ukraine and Russia, and it's very, unprecedented times and concerning times to know what will be happening next.
Yeah.
But we're going to begin by talking about a country that we've mentioned a couple of times on this podcast, but not lately, and that is Turkey.
Yeah.
Turkey is a very important player in the whole geopolitics of the Middle East,
yep.
and in terms of Israel's security.
Yeah.
And this week, Turkey has formally announced that it is cutting ties with Israel.
And
we're going to just have a discussion about why that is so significant. It's sad that they're cutting ties with Israel. We, a year ago, was it 2 years ago, that we were talking about Turkey and Israel warming ties, and various bilateral talks were going on. And we always do welcome when countries form agreements with Israel and the ties are warmed, but we weren't out partying to celebrate that in any way, because we were still quite very wary about that, and it has right now today collapsed.
Yeah. So, well, yeah, that's the thing. Turkey has always been on our radar, and it's always been a big concern. And even with those sort of times when they had sort of warming ties, there's always been a caveat behind it, sort of thing. We've both sort of said that even on this podcast, but it was many episodes ago that we were talking about Turkey. And actually, something internally we've been saying is always have an eye on Turkey, because and we've been told that by the US office as well, because actually we know, obviously with Bible prophecy, we know with just the way that the ties are between the two countries, that even if there is a signal that there is warming ties, ultimately Erdogan and his administration are very anti-Israel.
Yes.
And they have an Islamist viewpoint, which is very anti-Israel. It's not wanting Israel to exist, and also being very hostile to Jewish sovereignty in the Holy Land, sort of thing. So,
well, Erdogan has, of course, said quite repeatedly that he believes that Turkey should have control over Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Turkey.
Yeah.
Okay? So, and he means it. This is not just rhetoric for Erdogan. He is depending upon an almost sentimental, nostalgic, Ottoman-inspired nationalism in order to further his kind of political weight, not just in Turkey, but in the region. He very much sees Saudi Arabia, which has the mandate over the sites which Muslims regard as holy in Saudi Arabia. Saudis have custodianship of that, and Al-Aqsa is I think a prize for him to have custodianship of in order to bolster his idea of a strengthened Turkey. I don't know, it's almost the Ottoman Empire, or the ideology behind the expansion. And so yes, in the past year, he has repeatedly called on the Muslim world to boycott Israel. In fact, it was July this year that Erdogan seemed to suggest that he was threatening military action against Israel because he has been a huge critic of Israel's military action against Hamas. He earlier in the year he called for, he announced that his government would be enforcing a ban on Israeli trade, and he called upon the whole Muslim world to follow Turkey's example in banning trade with Israel and enforcing an arms embargo. And then this very week, it was announced that that Erdogan had called one of Turkey's exports companies to slow down the trade with Israel. In line with his calls for a complete ban. And also has enforced a vetting process to basically increase exports to the Palestinian authorities, which have to go via Israel. But he's basically bolstering exports to the Palestinians, and he's trying to bring down to zero all exports to Israel. So I don't think the announcement this week that they're cutting ties with Israel shouldn't come as any surprise whatsoever. Because he has made it quite clear he doesn't believe that Jerusalem, the Jewish capital, should belong to Jews. He wants it to be claimed for Turkey, and actually in the name of Islam. And he's calling upon the Muslim world to call for an arms embargo against Israel and to stop all trade with Israel. And has a military mindset that actually what cannot be achieved politically could well be achieved militarily.
And I think it does go back to his Islamist views, his Islamic upbringing. Erdogan was apparently known for being able to memorize and recite the Quran, and actually he was that's how he earned a living. He would stand on the bows of ships in a ferry port where he would, as people were being ferried back and forth to work and things like that, he would stand on the bow, sing Quranic verses and get paid tips, that kind of thing. But the Ottomans ultimately controlled Jerusalem for about 400 years before it was liberated in 1917 by the Brits when we liberated Jerusalem. But I think it shows like this isn't a new thing. This isn't something which is, just Erdogan's thought. I think it goes back a long way within the Turkish culture and a long way as well, obviously within Islam.
Certainly within the Turkish Muslim culture. I mean, you say Turkish culture, although I actually think it's the culture that Erdogan wants for Turkey. I'm not sure all Turks would agree with conquering Jerusalem. I know many Turkish people do not agree with Erdogan and his Islamist worldview. But that said, we know that radical Islam is growing and has spread in Turkey, partly also due to Erdogan's control and his power in the country. And Erdogan, we've said he has threatened to conquer Jerusalem and has spoken out against Israel. But Erdogan, we've spoken about the man Erdogan, but actually Turkey now then as a country and does have a significant role to play. Because if we take Erdogan's words, on the 11th of November this year, he said, as Islamic countries, we must pioneer the steps that can be taken against Israel, also calling for the Muslim world to stand united against Israel. And he said, it is extremely important to impose an arms embargo on Israel, end trade with Israel, and isolate Israel internationally unless its aggression ends, he said. And I think the word he uses there, isolate Israel, is quite telling, because that is what, and not just Turkey, by the way, but all opponents of Israel ultimately want to do. They want to try and isolate Israel, and the movements which are calling for Israel to boycott and applying sanctions and arms embargo is actually working towards that mindset of isolating Israel so that Israel can be cut off.
Yeah.
That's why we have to really speak out against the sort of arms embargo, the partial arms embargo, I should say, not sort of, the partial arms embargo that Britain is currently applying. Because actually, we should not be trying to isolate Israel at all. And so how much influence does Erdogan have in the region? And I would say that it has a large influence, particularly when you consider Turkey's ties with Iran, Turkey's ties with Azerbaijan, and Turkey's ties with Russia. And perhaps we can come on to now another thing relating to Turkey, announced last week, and that was Hamas being forced out of Qatar.
Yeah.
Because Hamas has been in Qatar. That's been well known and recognized.
Yeah.
That it has had a headquarters in Qatar. And it has also been the place where Hamas has been able to be contacted, let's put it that way, in part for its role in the failed negotiations for a ceasefire.
Yeah. And I think Qatar as well, when negotiators, they were heading up the negotiations, weren't they?
Yeah, that's right. They were the broker. But now the US, the current administration in the US, has put pressure on Qatar to kick Hamas out, apparently because of Hamas's non-compliability in terms of the negotiations, which is quite interesting because we've always said, Hamas has been the problem in coming to any sort of ceasefire agreement. Qatar has taken a different line. They have accused both Israel and Hamas of not complying with the negotiation, but actually, what we know is from the United States, from the Biden administration, is that they are putting the blame on Hamas for the failed talks. So Hamas has been kicked out. They still, by the way, have an office in Qatar, which was set up in order to facilitate these talks.
Right.
But they've been kicked out, and guess where they have found a new home?
Yeah, Turkey.
Yeah. They have set up residence in Turkey, which, by the way, Hamas have already got close connections with Turkey. They have various residences, various family members of Hamas leaders reside in Turkey. So it's unsurprising. But again, when you consider all these pieces of information which have actually come, they've progressed over the last few months, but then this past 2 weeks, we've seen these announcements by Erdogan. We've seen the situation of Hamas now moving from Qatar to Turkey. And you have to ask the question now, what next? Because Turkey is a very powerful country. They have a very large military force. And they are part of NATO.
Exactly.
And as a NATO member, other NATO members, of which Britain is one, should be putting pressure on Turkey not to go down this route of trying to isolate Israel, because it goes against what the West should be standing for.
It goes against what NATO should be standing for. And I think this is why it's concerning. For me, I do not really trust Qatar in all this as much as I don't trust Turkey in all this. Qatar is, as we've spoken about in the podcast before, they're the largest funder of Hamas, even larger than Iran. Al Jazeera, which is the Qatari sort of national broadcaster, they are very much pro-Hamas, putting out the Hamas propaganda against Israel, being very anti-Israel, and they've hoodwinked the West into believing that as well. So I don't trust Qatar. I think Qatar has the same aims as what Hamas does. They want to see Israel wiped out, the same aim as what Erdogan has. And I wonder if this is a strategic move. I'm just sort of thinking out off the top of my head as we're talking here. But for example, Israel has been taking out Hamas leaders. They took out Haniyeh in Iran. They took out, obviously, Sinwar in Gaza. They haven't really done anything in Qatar, but there might have been some sort of it might be a strategic thing to do, because just think about it. If Israel attacked Hamas in Qatar, yes, there would be a dispute between Qatar and Israel, but that's where it would, be between those two. Now, if Israel strikes any Hamas leader in Turkey, it means they've struck a NATO nation.
Yes.
And NATO are bound by, I think it's Article 5 of the NATO Pact, the NATO Treaty, that if one nation is attacked, all of the others have to defend the other.
Yes.
Which is why there's been this opposition to Ukraine joining NATO, because ultimately that would then put NATO at war with Russia if there was a spat there. So I do wonder if there is a strategic element
to this. It's very
to
interesting, because Qatar have actually said that they were not forced to remove Hamas.
Oh, there you go. So.
Which could align with that. But
and I didn't know that. I hadn't heard that side of things. Yeah, and I think, going back to the Islamic side of things, we have to understand this is a war of ideologies. It is a religious war. People want to make out it's just a war of land. It's just a dispute between two peoples. Unfortunately, it's not that way. And the more we understand it as Christians, then we understand the spiritual nature of it. And so Erdogan, for example, this is 2017, so this is why we've been concerned for a long time about Erdogan. He said in December 2017, those who think Jerusalem belongs to them today will not be able to find a tree to hide behind tomorrow. Now, anyone who understands the Islamic scriptures will know that is referring to one of the Quranic verses, which says, the messenger of Allah said, the last hour will not come until the Muslims fight against the Jews, until a Jew will hide himself behind a stone or a tree, and the stone or tree will say, O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. So that is referring to a religious war. And by the way, the last hour that is referred to there is sometimes as the last day. It is the Islamic version of the end times. The last day will not come until you kill the Jews. That's literally behind the beliefs of radical Islam. Yeah. And that's one of the many reasons. There's several reasons in Islam why they see Jerusalem as their land, but that's one of the reasons is that they have to go to war against the Jews in their mind. And I think it's really important that we understand this, because Erdogan is not just saying this because he's a politician. He's not saying this, he literally believes it's his religious duty to go to war with Israel to rid Jerusalem of the Jews, to rid the world of the Jews, just as he's commanded in the Quran.
Yes.
So,
yeah. Well, this is something we certainly need to pray about. It's important, as we speak about being watchmen on the walls of Jerusalem, and one of the roles of being a watchman is, yes, to watch, but it is also to warn. And in order to be able to warn, you have to be able to identify what is actually a threat.
Yeah.
We cannot be complacent. We cannot be slumbering. We have to be awake, and we have to be observant in order to really perceive or to discern what the threats are. And I think when someone like Erdogan makes these threats, it's not just rhetoric, as you've said. It's rooted actually in his Islamist thinking, but he has actually said these things repeatedly.
Yeah,
and he hasn't just said them; he has also now put into action, the arms embargoes, the cutting off trade to Israel. He's actually doing what he has threatened to do.
Yep.
So if he does what he has threatened to do in a political, non-violent sense, we have to take very seriously when he says Jerusalem is Turkish. It sounds outrageous.
Yeah.
But actually, we have to take that seriously. We know that he has ambitions for expansion. We know that that the Turkish government has been quite bullish in the Mediterranean. We know that Greece is an ally of Israel. I think having a view of these geopolitics, and plus Turkey's relationship with Iran, which could well get even stronger if the things continue to escalate like they are doing, and Iran's continues its strong support for Russia and Russia's military actions. So we don't have all the answers.
Nope.
But it's important that we know about these things and pray for Israel's defense.
Yep.
Now, let's lighten the mood a little bit now, Alex, shall we? And look ahead to something which CUFI is preparing for. We're preparing for Christmas.
Yep.
It is coming around the corner. And at the CUFI store, we have some Christmas cards available to purchase. I have some here. Sorry, I've not written yours yet, Alex, but it will be coming in the post, okay, very soon. But if you are writing your Christmas cards or soon to be writing your Christmas cards, then please do consider purchasing. We have a wonderful collection of Christmas cards to choose from.
We can put them out actually. To show people.
We can put them. We can put them out. Who's that from? Auntie who? There we are.
Hopefully, this will entice people to.
All of
make a purchase.
our Christmas cards are biblical themed, and all the proceeds go towards the work of Christians United for Israel UK. That's a wonderful thing about the products on our store. I mean, if I might say so, there's some beautiful products on our store, but all the funds do go towards the work of Christians United for Israel UK. So it's one way, actually, of being able to support the work and to be able to bless Israel and bless the work of CUFI.
Yeah.
And it's also a wonderful thing to be able to send a Christmas card which actually has Christians United for Israel on the back as well, so that you can show your friends and family that you support CUFI and you support Israel.
Yeah.
So I encourage you to consider going and visiting the store at store.cufi.org.uk, and those are the Christmas cards. And perhaps next podcast will show some other things that we have available as well.
Yeah, because there's lots of things on the store. There's obviously the calendar, which you can get. By the way, if you could just move that slightly, because I think someone watching might be thinking, they want to see all of them. There we go.
We don't.
I couldn't reach over there.
We don't want complaints.
So and if they aren't totally in line or anything like that, we do apologise. But hopefully you can see there's some nice designs there. We've obviously got candles, we've got anointing oils, different things like that. And as Alastair said, all of it goes to support the work of CUFI, to be a blessing to Israel and the Jewish people, because obviously not everything we do is talking about politics or anything like that. There's a lot of ways in which we try and be a blessing to the Jewish people, isn't there?
Absolutely, I agree. Right, let's get these up, because it's not Christmas yet. Come on. There we go.
We'll have it for our Christmas special.
Yeah, we will. Yes. Okay.
So,
right.
Next
Moving
subject.
on then.
Yep.
David Lammy. Do you want to take the lead on this one? Because he has been at the UN Security Council.
Yep.
And I'm hoping to hear that he has been showing his strong support for Israel, unequivocal, and, going to reverse the arms embargo, and is going to fly the Israel flag from the top of number 10.
Yeah. Well, no, that's definitely not happening.
Okay.
So I think, one of the things we do on the podcast actually is we often pull up a speech or a written letter that someone has put in, like the Archbishop or whoever.
We've not mentioned Archbishop Justin Welby yet in this podcast.
I know, we didn't need to, but I'll just say, this is one of those things where it starts out as a positive, but unfortunately it then goes negative, and we have to hold people to account for how they deal with Israel. So so David Lammy was speaking at the United Nations Security Council this week. Where
the UK Foreign Secretary, I should add, for anyone listening from overseas.
Yeah, that's right. So the UK Foreign Secretary was in where was it? New York at the United Nations Security Council, and he was giving a speech. He was talking about how there is a British hostage who is still being held by Hamas. Emily Damari, and she's the only British citizen that's being held in Gaza. There are some other people who are linked.
Still being held. There have been other British citizens.
Yeah, sadly, some other British citizens have actually been killed with their bodies being recovered and things. There is also an Israeli who's the husband of a British woman who is still being held, and he's both of them, Emily and also that individual, are thought to be alive still, but they're still being held. Actually, one sort of side note caveat: Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, was actually in Gaza this week, and he was saying they're now offering $5 million for any Palestinian who helps to give information to lead to the release of a hostage.
Wow!
So they're obviously trying to entice the Palestinian civilians who are now turning quite vocally against Hamas for all of the devastation. So obviously they're hoping that will lead to some people being released, but obviously at the moment that is still up in the air, and we don't know. We don't know what the situation is with talks. It seems like the talks are broken down. There isn't really any negotiations going on at the moment, but we will find out.
It's very important we continue to remember this, because it's we've now passed the 400-day mark since the October 7th attack. So 400 days those hostages have been held captive, and it's important that we continue to remember them. Let's not forget them. Let's continue to pray and pray that they will be released before the end of the year. And as soon as possible.
As soon as possible,
ASAP.
Definitely. Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, David Lammy actually did mention the 400 days in his speech. So I'll read some of what he said. So he told diplomats on Monday, Hamas still cruelly holds on to the hostages, including British national Emily Damari, extending their family's torment even further. He said there was no excuse for Hamas's hostage taking. They need to be set free. So that's all good stuff. We agree with that. He then said that the situation in Gaza is devastating and frankly beyond comprehension. He said that 400 days into the war, it's totally unacceptable that it's harder than ever to get aid into Gaza. In October, just 37 humanitarian trucks entered the strip each day, its lowest average in the last year. So obviously he's criticising Israel's humanitarian aid going between Israel and the Palestinian territories, and obviously we've debunked this quite a lot.
We have, despite the fact there are lorries which are still on the Gaza side of the border, which haven't yet been collected from humanitarian aid agencies, including the UN's aid agency. Yes, he said an average of 35 trucks a day. 37 trucks a day. We have debunked that, but and
even with that, we should point out, and obviously we do feel for the Palestinian people. We want them to be fed. We want them to have enough food. It is something that is an ongoing situation and crisis that needs to be resolved. But it's not through lack of trying or for Israel's, want of trying. They are supporting the Palestinians better than Hamas ever has done.
Yes.
And it just is one of these things where it's like, it almost feels like whenever Hamas is criticised, they also have to criticise Israel.
Yes, it does,
But he actually went on further than that. He spoke about Israeli extremist settlers, and he basically said they're working, they're working under an environment of impunity. And there was also, I think there were some sanctions actually that the UK put out against settlers. And you and I were having a bit of a chat before the podcast on this one, and we were sort of saying, like, sometimes when sanctions, like for example, when sanctions are normally placed on people, it's because they're terrorists, they are, killing people, all the rest of it. When you look at the disputes between settlers and Palestinians in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, a lot of the time it is just sort of disputes over land or disputes over a house or, an olive grove or something like that. And I was saying to you, it's a bit strange because there's like international outcry and international sanctions being placed upon people for basically it's like problem neighbours having a dispute over a border on a fence or something. You wouldn't normally think that would be an international headline.
No,
and
it wouldn't happen anywhere else in the world,
exactly.
would it?
And yes, I do understand that there are times where there have been, riots or there have been these sorts of things, but likewise, there are Palestinians going on riots against Israeli towns and villages and the settlers, quote unquote, because actually we don't see them as settlers, we see them Jews living in their homeland. And yet, as you rightly said, as we were chatting about it, there are literally, guerrilla, it's guerrilla warfare. There's different wars of various kinds. There's people being killed over multiple things, and they're, the warlords are not being sanctioned or being called terrorists and things, but the Israeli settlers are. I don't know. It's just something which I almost feel like it shouldn't be in the same breath as October 7th and the war and so forth. Do you know what I mean?
I know. And they do it to try and bring some balance, but it's actually they are just undermining the integrity of what they are, of their defense of Israel, by just having to mention it in order to appease and to try and be politically correct.
And also I think it undermines Israel in a way, because I think it is just one of those things where they're coming down very harsh on a situation which actually is just more of a dispute rather than actually a threat to life, that kind of thing. But anyway, going into some of the more pressing details or troubling details, I think, are also the way he sees a solution to this problem. And he said that he's calling for an immediate ceasefire, and he says the longer fighting continues, the deeper the depths of pain, of anger which corrode the bonds of common humanity, on which a lasting peace must necessarily be built. When the opening comes, we must be ready to seize it. That is obviously, it's kind of yes, obviously there will be more hurt the longer this war goes on. But that is kind of political jargon, really, for be ready for peace when it's available. Well, ultimately, Israel's been ready for peace for many years. And yet the Palestinians have rejected peace every single time. So I do think it's not kind of like it doesn't really matter what you say about peace, but I think it is a problem when he's putting the emphasis on it being because of the devastation Israel's causing, which is causing even more hurt, and then it's less likely for peace, that sort of thing. But this is the real sort of more troubling bit, which is that, what he wants for a lasting solution is based upon the two-state solution. And he said that, in a post-war Gaza, he wants it to be governed by a strengthened and reformed Palestinian Authority, which he says should be at the center of Gaza's future recovery. Which he says should be at the center of Gaza's future recovery, security, and governance. And then he lumps in what's happening with Gaza with the West Bank, and saying that there needs to be a credible, irreversible pathway to a Palestinian state. Irreversible, yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I've got a couple of things with that. First of all, that it's kind of like the two-state solution is kind of a mantra that is heard from all Western politicians, probably globally. At the UN, everyone keeps harping on about a two-state solution. And again, he wants an irreversible pathway to a Palestinian state. Goes back to, it's almost like a religious ideology they've got about, we have to make a Palestinian state. And he actually says, that this is what the world wants. This is what we will keep striving to achieve. And it's that kind of thing. We were talking about it last week with the Archbishop trying to get the whole world on board with this thing. This, again, he wants the whole world on board, and it should be an irreversible pathway. So basically, once there is a Palestinian state, it will be like unbreakable. Like, you can't go back on it, that kind of thing. And I just think that's massively problematic. Because ultimately, we believe the Bible. We believe that Israel should be there, irreversibly, that Israel should be there eternally, just as God has said about it. And I just think it is one of these troubling, factors of our current government.
It's also concerning when you consider the circumstances that would lead up to a Palestinian state if there was to be one, because right now the Palestinian leadership have not shown any evidence that they are capable of governing without also wanting to destroy Israel. And so actually what we're saying, or what this is suggesting, is that one outcome from Hamas's attempt to ethnically cleanse the nation of Israel is, let's give them a state. Now, I know that the government are not advocating that there's a Palestinian state with Hamas in charge. Quite the contrary, they've made it clear they want Hamas, not to be in control of a future or would-be future Palestinian state. But it does raise questions as to really why there is the belief that one outcome from the atrocities that have been committed, would be a state.
Yeah. Well, I think it's because all along, Western governments have wanted a state, a Palestinian state. And I think, there may be one in the future. You never know.
Yeah.
Like there could be something that happens where the Israeli government changes and, they actually accept a peace agreement and the West Bank becomes a Palestinian state. That still doesn't negate God's promises. It still doesn't mean Israel's over, but it will not mean it's the end of the conflict. And this is what people need to get around, because ultimately, I mean, I think he even says, let's have a look. He says about the security of the region even. There's even talk where it's like, oh, if Israel, or if this problem is solved, we'll have peace in the Middle East. If this problem is solved, we'll have peace globally. Well, I think that's proven false by the fact that, we see what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. We see what's going on with China and its sort of attempts with other countries like Taiwan and things like that. There's, and obviously Turkey. There are always going to be these warring factions. I think it is just part of human nature. And I think this is the same thing. It's like if the Palestinians get a state, they will just want a bigger state and they will want more of it until Israel is no more, because the aim is not to have a state for the Palestinians. The aim is to rid the land of the Jews.
Yes.
And all of this is linked together. It's all within the same ideology. I mean, even with Erdogan, who we've been talking about extensively, he's not just hosted Hamas. Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have had joint meetings with Erdogan.
Yes.
So Abbas himself went to Ankara, met with Erdogan, met with Haniyeh, and so and yet we've now got a foreign minister here, foreign secretary, who's saying we want the Palestinian Authority, which Abbas is the head of, who he's joined with Hamas and come out with statements. I mean, even when Hezbollah's commander was killed, Abbas said it was a tragedy, and he said he thanked Lebanon, meaning Hezbollah. He thanked Lebanon for their resistance and for standing with the Palestinian people. He was supporting the aims of Hezbollah. The same thing has happened. Fatah have spoken of pride of the Palestinian the Hamas leaders who were killed, saying that they were fighting for resistance and all this stuff. What I'm saying is, it's like we try as Westerners to sort of separate them out and say they're different things and that sort of thing. Ultimately, it's the same spirit behind it. The same. They've got the same goals. They've just got different ways of going about those goals. Basically, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, we need to continue to pray for the UK government, and that will take a bolder, stronger stand for Israel, and a non-compromising one, because I think it's fair to say that this has been a problem with successive UK governments. It isn't just come about with David Lammy's leadership, and it has been a problem of continued compromise, sitting on the fence, and in some cases a bias against Israel, which looking at some of the track records so far under Starmer's government is a worrying indication of perhaps the pathway to come. But that's why CUFI exists, right? Christians United for Israel. We're here in the UK making a stand for Israel and the Jewish people, and we are wanting to try and roll back some of this misjudged and unwise decisions that the UK is making. We also need to pray for the church in Britain, and with the decision yet to be made regarding who the next Archbishop of Canterbury is, we need to pray that it will be a God-fearing leader who is going to act according to the Bible in all areas, including a position on Israel. And so we don't, I think I speak for all of us, I hope, but we say we don't want an Archbishop of Canterbury who's going to subscribe to replacement theology.
Yeah.
And so let's pray into that and pray that the right person is selected. Now, we're non-denominational here at CUFI, so we know that there will be many who are listening who are not Anglican, but I think it's important to recognise that the Archbishop of Canterbury has a very significant influence in Britain, in both the spiritual climate as well as the influence over the political direction of the nation also. And God says in his word that he will bless a nation that blesses Israel, and actually he will curse those that curse Israel also. And when it comes to choosing the right person for that role, we need to pray that that person will actually become an advocate for Israel, and will use that influence to hopefully get Britain onto the right track. And of course, our trust is not in man and not in human leaders. Our trust is in God, and God has the final say. So let us all act according to his word and obey God's word in our own lives. I also think that God will bless the church in Britain if the church blesses Israel. That's our heart. I hope that's your heart. And Christians United for Israel has a very instrumental role in that. So what we would say is thank you very much for your support. Thank you for standing with us here at CUFI. We do need your support, and I think it's fair to say that we cannot do what we do without your help. In fact, we would like to do even more, which is why we are so thankful that there are many Christians who are getting on board with CUFI and helping us achieve our goals. But please, as we go towards the end of this year and into 2025, we would ask that if you're not already supporting CUFI in a practical way, to please consider becoming a supporter by going to www.cufi.org.uk/donate, and all your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you also for praying for this ministry. We are really encouraged by all of your comments on YouTube and on the other platforms that this podcast is aired on. And we read them. We want to thank you for your encouragement about the positions that we take, and just for expressing your love and support for Israel. And we would invite you to please leave your comments about the topics we've discussed today. I think it's fair to say also, Alex, that we received a lot of negative abuse about our position on standing with Israel as well. And, we don't really care about that, because we believe that we are standing with what God says. And God has the final say. But I think it highlights the fact that, as we continue to speak out, there are going to be those who are going to be upset with what we say, simply because they are anti-Semites. And we are speaking out against anti-Semitism because we want to be a voice, a Christian voice, which stands with the Jewish people side by side and will not apologize for that. So thank you for helping us be that voice, and let us remember what God's word says, that for Zion's sake, I will not be silent. For Zion's sake, we will not be silent, and we encourage you not to be silent also. Let's be bold, let's have courage, and let us speak the truth. But for now, from me and from Alex, we will see you next time. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Bye-bye.